We had the pleasure of just having Sam for his Pro 2 over in Jackson, and it was quite painful to watch two lovely people, but very much practitioners and guides, explain snow mechanics to the group with like Sam in the group. So Alex kind of took my presentation idea, but it's been a phenomenally interesting season for forecasting.
Bend that so it's closer to your
Can you, a little bit better? Soft spoken, it doesn't work well for these things. But I can relabel this presentation the DDL versus what I call the LDDL. And the DDL stands for December drought layer. And if you say DDL in Jackson, everyone knows which year you're talking about. And I named this season the LDDL because it's the longer December drought layer. It was dry for a little bit longer. And I was first actually introduced to the DDL in my bridge course with Big Don. He did a case study on it because in May, he had gone skiing on Mount Taylor, which is a frequently skied piece of terrain outside of Jackson. And a day later, it produced just a huge wet slab avalanche. And so he was grappling with this, like, how good of a forecaster am I issue, which I grappled with a lot this season as well. So I also wanted to prove Daveson wrong.
Okay.
He told me forecasting was easy. And I found it quite hard this season. I also wanted to compare and contrast two seasonal patterns because that's how we operate as forecasters, right? We notice a pattern, we pick up on it, and our job is also to notice that subtle distinction and difference, right? A difference in depth in a season can make things behave a lot differently. A big question for me this season was, does propagation in a pit equal unstable conditions? Because not always are those two things overlapping, especially in December of this year. And then I want to highlight some difficulties of public messaging and the power of crowdsourcing data in OBS. It's pretty wild with the NAC platform. What a difference just a few OBS can make on the spatial distribution of what you're seeing in your activity. We can talk a little bit about this, a rarely used forecast. There it is, the Hamburglar. This is called the cheeseburger. But can happen during specific circumstances, which we'll talk about this season. So to back up, this is all of our OBS for the season. We have 770. We had 2 snow immersion fatalities, 1 snowmobiler fatality in the Sierra Madre, which is further south, and we had 1 skier fatality in our southern zone in the Salt River Range here. And I just really want to emphasize how useful it was to just look at other forecast centers and what they were doing this season. I'm like the third generation of avalanche forecasters in the US. Like, this is still pretty much a young science and art, and we're still learning a lot, and I feel like the products that we're offering are getting better and better, and we're collaborating a lot more between forecast centers and organizations, and it's phenomenally helpful to do. Because sometimes the message is tough to write. So this is December. Big Omega block sat over the US for about 3 weeks. Pretty remarkable. And it was remarkable that we kind of all had a little bit of snow beforehand, and then this just sat here and dried everyone up. So we had fairly similar snowpack structure, just kind of variable depths. And so that resulted in this. The sawtooth hung on to the perma-mod there. But pretty much everywhere was low hazard. And in a matter of a week, we go to this everywhere. Prior to that December drought, we had some snow on the ground throughout November that faceted it out and formed a bunch of surface hoar and near surface facets. And we had a pretty small slab though. And then throughout December, we saw a taper in activity, which we'll talk about. This was our rows for the last 2.5 weeks of December of avalanches. One is me in the big holes outside of our forecast zone because I was desperate to find an avalanche anywhere. So I found a tiny wind slab, put it in the obs. I was like, yes. And then one was a small snowmobiler triggered wind slab. But when we were looking at this for observations, our reasoning to go to low hazard was based on this data. And we'll talk a little bit about what we were getting in pits next to this data as well. But in 2 weeks, at the start of January, we started getting more snowfall, and we went to that. So these two drought periods are here and here in November. Get a little bit of loading. We had some activity in December, and then dry over this time again. And I'm going to focus more on this period of time because it was dry for a lot longer, and it formed a layer that was active for a lot longer. But backing back up to these November facets, throughout December, even throughout dry weather conditions, when we were kind of slowly just faceting out any sort of slab that was there and just adding more and more to that deep layer, I showed this to Grom. He was like, no one's going to read that. I just want you to look at how many P's are there over time. This is start of December, and then it reads down this way. Sorry, this is from our meetings, so it's a little chaotic. But I just want you to notice how many P's are there for how long. And this is through dry weather, right? And similar story here, propagation in pits and the moderate to strong strength in pits, but no avalanche activity. People are skiing everything, no avalanche activity. So it's quite hard because you could get this to propagate in pits, tons of collapsing, but like people are riding every piece of terrain and no one is triggering an avalanche. And this is a pretty hard problem for us to forecast hazard from, and we weren't really sure what to do with it, right? No natural avalanches too. So when we're working with the conceptual model, like where do you go and how do you fit these conditions into there? It's kind of interesting. So we would have some forecaster debates, but just really interesting snowpack setup. We'll move on to comparing. Interestingly, this is 2017 hazard ratings. This is this year. 2017, 2018 was quite a bit deeper for them. They started out a lot earlier, but there's interesting overlap. Like they're pretty similar looking years, hazard forecast-wise. And then peak instability for both periods was in January, so I kind of focused on the peak period of time. And we've had 60 days of considerable hazard. Over half of the forecasts we've issued this season have been considerable, which is pretty unique. And pretty challenging to forecast if the community forecast for has the Teton considerable sort of mindset. So the DDL formed over a period of 2 weeks in 2017, 2018, and our December drought was around 24 days, maybe even longer. And these Ys, if you are not familiar with our snowpack tracker, the Ys are just formed from weather data and are just telling you whether surface or near surface facets are forming. So this is that peak in time in activity for us. And you can actually see four tinier peaks within this, and I kind of delved deeper into those just to see what would make this layer talk over time. As soon as it started getting buried deeper and deeper, we sort of had some issues forecasting because we already had a persistent slab issue with that November facet layer. And then we formed essentially another facet layer that was buried January 4th. And so when you're forecasting these two issues, you have a persistent slab, and then you have another persistent slab, and then over time you're getting a deep persistent slab because that snow is at the base of the snowpack with a persistent slab on top of it. So you're starting getting into these nuances of forecasting like different layers at different depths that are still lingering and persistent, and just how to best message the public with that. So this first spike, second, third, fourth, are the activation periods. And you can see we're getting some pretty big avalanches. A lot of these were D3, and a lot were really wide, just theoretically, or we theorize because of the involvement of surface hoar, especially in the middle elevations. So those are the 4 peaks. This is new snow total, along with SWE. But essentially, the activity came with new snow loading. The next peak was just no new snow, well, very little new snow, but just a different wind direction caused a spike in activity on a different aspect. We had a warm or an upside down storm, which caused another spike. And this is where we started wondering how to message 2 persistent problems. And then it was just hot. That also has caused a... So this first activity, this is Teton Pass, Devil's Slide. This is where we first started to notice that, this is going to be a problem. I mean, we knew going into it, but just how bad it would be was kind of always unknown until that first snowfall when you bury something. And this is where I was like, people really need to grasp how hazardous this is. Because as you know, like Teton Pass is like the drive up danger fun zone for people. And this is an area that's just, there's usually a skin track across here. We really started to emphasize like this is not your normal year. And I actually found it really helpful to start referencing the DDL, like in our State of the Snowpack talks, or just in a forecast. Just calling to memory a time that people have experienced that was just as hazardous really enables your forecast a little bit more because it ties it to a point in time that they remember being pretty scary. And until then, it just seems like a normal considerable rating, which in the Tetons is like wind slaps. Carl smiled. We usually get a pretty deep snowpack in the Tetons, and so this problem, we started out with a pretty shallow snowpack, and this problem was very touchy. So tying in their minds this time to the DDL was pretty useful for forecasting. Really cool avalanches, really wide. This is Static and Buck Cirque. Everything really well connected. We had surface hoar growth all the way up to 9,000 feet. And it was pretty incredible to drive around and just glass after any time it snowed for that period in January. I put in a video next because Alex had a video for this. It was really fun. Fun, unstable snow, really interesting and engaging. I've never had so many ECTPVs in my life before this season. And so many interesting tours where you could walk along a tour or a skin track on Teton Pass, like a set skin track, and you'd still get collapsing on a skin track. And that just goes to show if you form a really thick layer of near surface and bury it, and you're just slowly collapsing like different parts of it over time, it's just really interesting. So this is still activity number 1. Again, huge avalanches. These are all those D3s. Then we have activity 2. This just occurred with about 5 inches of new snow and a change in wind direction. And again, activity on this layer. And it's now about 2 feet deep. And this is also about when we started to forecast those November facets as a deep slab. And then our January 4 layer, or the December facets, all these names, as a persistent slab. And again, just really trying to impart to people that this is not a normal year for the Tetons. And this is all along Teton Pass, these two. And this facet layer was so thick, it would just refill. So everything was re-avalanching again and again and again. And then this is our skier fatality, a photo of that avalanche. Just a really small avalanche in nasty terrain. but people operate, you know, here in the Tetons, everywhere. A lot of unfamiliarity of things, right? Again, in the Tetons, used to just dealing with a lot of surface snow problems. And so it's really hard to tell people to utilize terrain differently. And at the end of the day, it's kind of easy to forget, especially after a season like this, that people just want to have fun, right? And when we're messaging them and it feels like it's serious, because it is, you can also turn them away from that message if you really hammer too hard on just how serious it is. So it's really interesting to try to hit, you know, a subtle divide between, or a balance between, informing people with enough information, but also knowing that they're going to make their own decisions and they're going to go out there anyways, and how to best inform that for them. There's 2, again, everything was really wide, really neat avalanche cycle. This is 25 short, so typically storm skiing for people. Really interesting big avalanches, and we're getting activity on both layers. And then this is 4. We had a wet slab cycle at the end of January with the warm-up. So between the 2 seasons, it was really interesting to note that by January 30th on both, so those December facets were buried January 4th. On the 30th, the same number of avalanches had occurred between the DDL and this year, which was pretty interesting, and a pretty similar spatial pattern. The only difference being that these DDL avalanches are bigger. If you look at the coloring here, yellow is depth, or the coloring difference is depth. So green is less than or up to a foot. And then we have between 12 and 44 inches, and then greater than 44. This season was quite a bit deeper by that time of year. So they were having deeper avalanches that were larger, but pretty similar spatial spread. By late February for ours, cornices were the only thing triggering Jan 4 now. It just got buried really deeply. And with the DDL season, every time they would get snow loading, they continued to get activity on it, which was a pretty interesting distinction. And this is a pretty challenging time for us as a forecasting team as well, just because, again, a taper in activity only being triggered by cornices, and there is this debate about whether to take off this problem because skiers weren't triggering it. People were skiing everything, and it was only being triggered by cornice fall. But being from Montana, raised in this snowpack, I doubled down and made sure we just moved it to a deep, persistent problem. Kept the same message that this is a really, really low probability, but very, very high consequence problem. And if you're still getting activity, even with cornice fall, it's still there. And people need to know about it. And this is the type of activity we'd get with a big enough trigger, which is these really nasty avalanches, stepping down to both layers. This is on the no-name face. Photo credit to the webcam, the top of JHMR. Yeah. And it was interesting to look back through, there's a seasonal snowpack history tied to the BTAC, and they used to, we still do them, but weekly snowpack summaries. And it was interesting to look back and see similar avalanches in similar locations for both seasons because the structure of the snowpack was pretty similar. Actually, eerily similar avalanches. This is on Horseshoe Bowl off of Teton Pass. If you go at Mount Glory, it's like boop, boop, 2 bumps over. This is the DDL season. And then this is this season, right around the corner, but same avalanche. Really similar visually, and very similar aspects. So the DDL activated about 6 times, and we're on activity 9 of this season. And This is as of yesterday with activity between both seasons. So again, 2017, 2018, and then this season. Interestingly, this is 2017, 2018. Snow water percent of median ended up being pretty similar. We actually had quite the comeback in the Tetons, which is also why we chose to forecast there, because typically it's pretty good snow. And things get buried pretty deeply, which is kind of the only thing you can do with a problem like this. Like a facet layer that thick, the only thing you can do is smush it really well over time, bury it really deeply. And I was looking at differences. I'm going to do some, like a good persistent graduate student. I'm going to do some stats that I don't have ready for this yet, but just to see, anecdotally, this winter was really warm. It's already well known that this is one of the warmest winters on record. And that's one of the primary differences I noted, because the depths aren't that different. We caught right back up to the 2018 year. And just a note on this, we had a really interesting banding of surface hoar, and it was quite hard to message that the middle elevations, especially like right along Teton Pass, were very hazardous for a while. We had no snow down low for quite a long time, and then up high, a lot of the facet layers were getting buried so deeply they were pretty hard to trigger at this point in time. But it was interesting to just put this out and just wonder who was reading our forecast, like shaking their head, wondering what we were thinking. But it was just at the perfect depth for skiers to trigger there, like about 2 feet deep in the middle elevations. Some takeaways. Dave Zinn's wrong sometimes. Forecasting is hard. It's easy in the fact that we spend most of winter, right, as Davis said to me, in 2 hazard ratings, right, moderate or considerable. We had a lot of days of high this season, but it's harder when it comes to the messaging, right? When we're choosing avalanche problems and the best way to message them and how many problems to have and how to show them on a rose. Like, this is quite hard to do sometimes because you want to enable people, like, help guide them where to go too, not just where not to go. Overlapping problems are just tough, especially right now. We're experiencing the same thing. We're having a persistent, right in that taper between dry and wet snow, there's like moist snow activity, which I'm going to lobby to have as a problem. It's pretty interesting. Right when you're getting activity, a lot of the avalanches will look wet by the time they avalanche down, but they start dry. And like just sitting on a forecast morning thinking like, okay, is it going to be warm enough to have wet slabs and then but still have a persistent slab problem on your north aspects? And just the nuance with messaging people with that. Talk to other forecast centers. I did that a lot this year. I think I reached out to everyone from Colorado to NWAC to here, just to see how they were dealing with it, because we did have a similar setup everywhere. And just having that feedback on like, am I crazy? This is what we're seeing? Like, this is what we're seeing with our pits. What are you guys doing? Just having that dialogue is really useful. And the importance of travel advice for people in the forecast, because a lot of the time they're just operating kind of on the color for a lot of users, and really getting them to like dig into the travel advice, because there is sort of a spectrum, right? There's an upper end and a lower end of every hazard rating. And when it's really on the upper end of considerable, you really want people to know that and help guide them. And that's why I like referencing the DDL a lot. It was helpful on people. It was a helpful mental clue for people. Because again, these avalanches, that's blurry, were really nasty. They would wrap around terrain features that were lower angle that people commonly use to get up things. Like, for example, these are a week apart, skin track up this ridge. And really just showing people the terrain that they're familiar with and what it's looking like when it has this problem in the forecast. And then for the spring, this was DDL in May. It caused some like D3.5 avalanches in places. And I'm thinking that that will happen this year as well. So it's useful to just look back into history and see what avalanche then and sort of try to predict, what's going to happen once we get a larger warm up without any refreeze happening. That's it.
Questions for Gabrielle?
Dave's in.
Well, I noticed that you talked to a lot of people from different avalanche centers. This is one of the points you made. I was just curious if I was the only person that was wrong.
Yes. I mean, no one's really ever wrong or right in this, right?
That's where we have jobs.
It's more just like what is the best method for these things for the public, and especially the public that you have. Like, I mean, people are pretty critical of the forecast in Jackson, right? And you have such a diverse user group. You have this center similar to here, a center that has like guides and strong contingency of local skiers that want they're going to go skiing in high danger, and they want to know just like the data, and then they're going to go from there. And then you have people, who are just looking at a color, and they're deciding not to go up a really steep drainage that you can't even get to without entering avalanche terrain, and they're making that decision based on color, and that's it. So, yeah.
So along those lines, obviously, I can sympathize with the difficulties of forecasting for seasons like this, but as an avalanche educator, how can we, do you have suggestions for educating people as far as following new travel advice or reading the forecast with a different set of eyes, or even just recognizing the extenuating circumstance of a season like this? So as we educate kind of the next generation of people, it makes your job easier.
Totally. Yeah, that's a great question. And I've started kind of the breakdown of the SEMA, where it has like how we determine likely and possible and sizes and like reactive versus dormant. I've actually, when I've been giving State of the Snowpack talks, I put the North American hazard scale there, and I actually make them read like what it means, and then we go through on the SEMA and we go through and figure out what they would choose for that day. Because also, Dave's in quote, every day a skier goes skiing and they don't trigger an avalanche, the danger feels low. And when they do, the danger feels high. And so with educating, I think it's just important that they understand how broad of a spectrum of conditions can fit into one hazard rating. So with educating too, like actually having people understand what goes into the avalanche problems too, like that's a packet of information. And I think often they can just be like kind of glazed over, but actually like reading in depth into that and then understanding like how a forecaster is coming up with a hazard rating, I think really informs like the information you can take from it. I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
I just like going back to the beginning, you were talking about stability tests and like getting propagation when you weren't seeing anything, but also getting whoops. And like, that was the interesting thing. Like we had that this year, and there were like times it was like 10 days after a snowfall, and people were still getting whoops like every time you left the skid track.
Yeah.
But no averages.
Yeah.
And like that, like, cause you can like explain away a stability test, like you isolate it, whatever. It's weird. Like you tell everybody that like a whoops is an avalanche off that terrain, but it's not like people weren't getting near steep slopes.
Yeah.
What the fuck?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts?
That's what you get paid.
I mean, that's why it was so hard. Same story in the Tetons, right? You have all these signs of instability as far as like, and they're secondary, right? They're not primary. The primary would be signs of avalanches and avalanches happening. And the secondary is like what's in a pit. And it was hard to like have all these secondary signs, but no primary, because usually they're aligned in time, and they weren't.
Yeah. Take one more, Eric.
More of a comment than a question, but kind of looking at the big picture, there have been 13 fatalities this season in the US, and it seems like with a really spicy kind of snowpack regionally, that number could certainly be higher. So from a public messaging standpoint, it just seems like it's really working. Avalanche education, public messaging really, I think, is sinking into people. So whether you find it being difficult, no matter what center, it is a difficult task, but good job to the BT and the Gallatin and everybody for getting that message across, because it seems like it's clearly working.
No, I
mean,
couldn't.
13 is still not a great number, but it could be 30.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. And even like people that have lived in the Tetons for a long time, after we had a big storm, is the first time in 15 years that there wasn't a skin track across Titmouse Bowl, which is just commonly people just skin right across the face. First time in 15 years it wasn't there. So people like actually picked up on it. Sometimes it just takes them a little bit of time, and you have to really, use some powerful messaging, like funny videos. I love Dave Zinn's videos.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
Yeah, thanks.